This is the Open University.
The internet is rubbish, the internet is complete bullshit, and everything on the internet is just distracting you and ruining your eyesight. And that's why it's important to go out in summer and to do things and see things in the real world and look at the things which are not screens in front of you. I've got this screen in front of me just to prompt me with some notes about this summer and my travels with this delightful air hostess you just saw in Italy mostly, but also Germany. The two great summer... Oh, here's my fly swatter. In case there are any mosquitoes or trolls. So, yeah, basically in summer, still recovering a little bit from COVID, but my opportunistic BA5 infection, which disappeared just the very day that I was due to take a train from Paris to Milan on the way to Venice to see the Biennale, and then following that up through the Alps on trains again to Documenta in Kassel, which is only once every 5 years. And which is, they were both very seriously themed this year, and they were intended to make the sort of bohemian bourgeois clientele, the visitors to such exhibitions, just guilty enough about themselves to feel good about themselves. So I want to really think about this idea of guilt as a motor in the art world, guilt as a kind of driver of spectacle, and what we're really doing when we service our guilt, or when these big art institutions try to repoint us morally. It's like a little bit of house maintenance, or repointing your dry stone wall or something like that. Are we actually achieving anything by shunting moral concerns and ethical issues into the art world when they're not really very much in evidence in other parts of our lives? I would say yes, it's worth doing. My general conclusion is that I enjoy being made to feel guilty. It makes me feel there's some kind of karma out there in the world, and that I'm being punished for things which my ancestors did, even if I haven't personally done them. The Milk of Dreams is what the curator this year has titled the Venice Biennale, and it's that was a promising title because although there was obviously an identity politics drive in the selection of the artists, which is fine, mostly women artists and mostly people from what's now called the Global South. I didn't want that to be the theme of the exhibition as well. And actually, interestingly enough, what the cumulative effect of the Venice Biennale this year reminded me of was an exhibition in 1989 called Les Magiciens de la Terre, The Magicians of the Earth, which was held at the Pompidou Center. And it was curated by someone called Jean-Hubert Martin, who wanted to find non-Western contemporary artists. So they had over 100 non-Western contemporary artists, living artists from Asia, East Asia, Africa, Latin America, but also the Inuits and the Pacific artists. And this has become it was a bit like WOMAD in the 80s. There was a lot of guilt around it, which was the accompaniment to Thatcherism and neoliberalism. And so there was a kind of this sort of antithesis and accompaniment to our rapacious neoliberal selfishness. So this Magicians of the Earth exhibition, which I saw in the late 80s here in Paris, has become a kind of template for these guilty biennials. And Documenta this year as well, very much, you're not in Documenta if you're not from Africa or Latin America or Indonesia. And in fact, the curators were Indonesians, a collective. Also, you're not in Documenta if you're an individual artist. You have to be a collective now. And there was controversy, of course, in the first week or so when this Indonesian collective at Documenta exhibited some drawings which had apparently some anti-Semitic stereotypes in them. So those, by the time we got there, those had all been taken away. And it just shows that the Achilles heel of identity politics is the narcissism of minor difference with other victim groups. So you basically have sibling rivalry. When you get tribal, as you do in identity politics, it's all about my race or my gender or my sexual orientation. You inevitably have sibling rivalry, and this allows the the authorities who were controlling the real politics to divide and rule. So that was all taken away by the time we arrived, and all that was left in front of in the Friedrichsplatz in Kassel was an Aboriginal embassy, which was an Australian Aboriginal artist's contribution, a tent, because of course the Aboriginals are a stateless people, a bit like the Palestinians, they don't have a homeland, and yet, so the idea of an Aboriginal embassy is kind of ironic. Both of these exhibitions were like coffee steam spurts of guilt and anger, anger-inducing guilt. Oh, thank you. Oh, that's a Kumamon badge, Kumamon saluting and dressed in uniform beside a Shinkansen, a bullet train. And they were really designed to leave you feeling just bad enough about yourself to feel good about yourself. In other words, to enjoy your Protestant guilt about slavery and the colonies and all the rest of it. Also, it struck me as kind of relational aesthetics in which you relate to people you will never meet. A bit like when you're in Japan, you're shopping in Japan, you can buy things from all over the world, or you can listen to bossa nova music, but you'll never meet a Brazilian, or you'll never meet those immigrant people from the countries you're buying the products from. You can, but the relational aesthetics aesthetic was from about 20 years ago, and it was all beanbags and pot plants and kind of opportunities to relate. It was artists from Thailand doing cooking events for their friends where, cooking was the art, and the relationships. I think Jerry Saltz, the New York art critic, put it very well when he said, "We are the new sublime. Each other is the new sublime." Us relating to other people in exhibition spaces became a kind of sublime in the romantic sense, of a kind of the ultimate achievement. And of course, post-COVID, it has become a new kind of sublime to relate to people, to even be at these exhibitions is a kind of little miracle post-COVID, to be mingling without face masks in large public spaces. So it felt really good, and to go to the visitor centre for Documenta, which was very, trendily and beautifully made by, in fact paid for by my German bank, which is the Sparkasse. So the logo of the Sparkasse, it used to be Deutsche Bank, but Deutsche Bank is out of favour because of all sorts of corruption scandals and things. So now it's the Sparkasse which has stepped into the gap. And a kind of faux didactic decor everywhere, which is very much my style. I love that, coming from a long family of teachers, a line of teachers. I love school chairs. There were these school chairs in exuberant arcs which were shooting up across each room, and a lot of very cheap plastic but brightly coloured plastic furniture, and a lot of children's rooms, play areas. Homo ludens by Huizinga, the Dutch theorist, very much present in my mind as I drifted from room to room. There wasn't really a sense of the individual artist. My first Documenta, I think it was 1993. I first went to Documenta with my London friend Tommy. We rented a car and drove there. And there was a great big Jeff Koons sculpture outside the Verederseum, living flowers puppy, a puppy made of living flowers.
A gigantic puppy made of living flowers.
And although it was kind of populist gesture, it was very much the kind of the white male artist, with a vision of the world. Jeff Koons, possibly the last of these kind of major white male artists to make it into shows like Documenta and the Venice Biennale, because now you have to be a collective and you have to be from a country that we've never been to make it, and there is no big kind of bold gesture anymore. So there was no sense of this being a contemporary art event about individual artists anymore. It was about collectives, about people who are all on the same page, well, seem to be, at least until we get onto little divisive topics like anti-Semitism, on the same page ideologically with the curators. And it's all about righteous indignation on the part of the collectives and the Global South people, and a kind of institutional guilt on the part of the curators and the supporting institutions like the banks, which are paying for it. So, but I really enjoyed the sense of optimism that you got in that room in Documenta, especially in the I can never pronounce it, Friedrich's name, a museum on the Friedrichsplatz there, which felt like almost like when you go to the Architecture Biennale in Venice, you get a sense of the positivity, the optimism of people who believe in a future, a good future, a nice future, a future which is better than the present, which is something we've really lost massively, despite technological advances which have all led us down shitty paths like TikTok. We've kind of lost it since the 60s. So I always think that those bright, optimistic, childish colours are kind of like a 60s aesthetic, and that's where my music often comes from, although my music is sinister. We have to talk about music actually as well, but I wanted to just hit a few of the buzzwords of these, both of these exhibitions. Outreach, community outreach was suddenly very important, and Documenta wanted to reach out to local artists and children and schools and local groups like that, community groups. Commoning, another buzzword. Roma artists as well, since my girlfriend, her mother is Gypsy. A lot of Roma collectives, artists from that community exhibiting all through that, especially that museum, which I can't pronounce. And so I thought that was interesting, that you would go from one room which was all about gypsies to another room about South Africans to another room about Indonesians or something. So you would get a little kind of holiday effect of cheap holidays and other people's misery, essentially. And you'd get your strings, your liberal strings would be being tugged at each new community of deprived or unfairly neglected people as you went from room to room. Reynaldo Arenas, there's a big film about a Cuban gay artist, a writer, novelist who'd been persecuted by the communist regime in Cuba. This kind of thing, a lot of forgotten historical figures in the Venice Biennale, for instance, in the Italia Pavilion, there was a whole room about mid-20th century surrealist women artists who'd been, eclipsed often by their husbands, their much more famous husbands. Music, though, is really what I draw my most inspiration from because I'm like a kind of recycling, pillaging locust when I descend on these exhibitions in order to get ideas for my own work. And I really usually come away with musical ideas. So this time, I was particularly impressed by an Italian artist based in Milan called Diego Marcon, who did a work called The Parents' Room. And it's a song, sort of prosthetic acting, I think by Diego himself, dressed up as a pater familias, a father of the family who had killed his whole family, and was singing this rather guilt-free song about having done so, just confessing that he killed everybody, but then saying, oh, but also I killed myself. So as if that was kind of his recompense. That was his making good for having killed his whole family.
shot myself and lay down and died.
Naomi said as we left that little room, which was empty, nobody clustering around that film, Naomi said, well, that's like a MoMA song, isn't it? Actually, it's very like the Peter Grimes song on my current album. A kind of morally provocative because morally editorializing song about someone just making a confession. I'm always particularly interested in doing that. But it was beautifully arranged. He went to London and worked during a residency with a group of musicians from a music school. The other reference that you kept coming across in both of these biennials was Frantz Fanon. I mean, he wrote several books really of post-colonial outrage against the white colonial system. So despite the curatorial guidelines, I did find there was a kind of milk of dreams emerging in both of these exhibitions. But I was talking about the music, wasn't I? The Japan Pavilion, I always have to talk about the Japan Pavilion in the Giardini in Venice. This year it was an exhibition in which Dum Type, which is a Kyoto-based mostly dance and performance troupe, founded in 1984 by Teiji Furuhashi, who died of AIDS. He was a gay man who died of AIDS in the mid-90s. They were doing, they took over the Japan Pavilion and put little, very well-processed stereo music going around some posts, and also there were projections of LEDs of texts based on an old geography textbook, like how many oceans are there in the world, and you'd have these voices answering these questions, but all very fragmented. And actually one of the voices was Kihimi Kari, who I worked with, as you probably know, in the 90s. So that was interesting to see Kihimi again. Also, we had Aki Sasamoto, who I did an exhibition with in New York in 2009, a dual performance exhibition where I was a kabuki stagehand who would interrupt her performances in which I would claim to be about to make her famous as an artist. So yeah, she had her own pavilion in the Venice Biennale, just as you were leaving the site in the gardens. It was kind of shed in which she's sort of doing like a vending machine snail factory or something, like breeding snails, and then the snail shells were being blown around on tabletops with some little polystyrene balls. And I kind of missed a little bit the performance element. She wasn't there in person, and her work is usually best when she's there in person performing. You often get the performance in the first week or 2 weeks of the Venice Biennale, and then just relics of performances are left behind. But other music, just yesterday here in Paris, saw a really great thing at Lafayette Anticipation, which was by Lina Lapelite, a Lithuanian artist who actually was wowing us at the last Venice Biennale because she had a pavilion. I unfortunately missed it because it was like a 2-hour queue to get in, but she had a performance called The Beach, in which various sunbathers on a beach, and inside beach, spotlit, were singing a kind of opera. We missed the Star Pavilion, which is the Lithuanian pavilion. We joined a queue for the sort of beach. It's called Sun and Sand, or Sea and Sand, I think, this installation of Lithuania, which was a kind of operatic scene of actors. It reminded me a bit of Tino Segal's kind of installations back in the day. About 10 years ago, Tino Segal doing relational aesthetics in dark rooms where actors would start singing. They'd be crowding around you and then they'd start singing. And that was very effective. Or you'd be led by the hand by a child through the ICA in London, that kind of thing. This was a kind of observation deck from which you could see this synthetic beach on which opera singers were dressed as, or they were in bikinis and things, dressed as people at the seaside. So she's got the same kind of thing going in central Paris now in Le Marais, Lafayette, Anticipation. There's a room full of nettles, heaps of earth and nettles, and then these singers who are singing songs which Naomi said sounded like Toog songs because they're kind of very minimalist electronics, and then these choral parts on top of them. So in a way, it's a bit like foraging through a second-hand shop or a market or something. When you go to these things, the curator has foraged in world culture for things which are interesting, curious, and things you wouldn't come across on your own travels through the internet, which will probably just keep coming up against awful cliches and kind of advertising, basically nothing but advertising. Tarek Atoui, I think it's Tarek Atoui, was the thing I liked in the following biennial, which was an installation based on Chinese ceramic folk arts from South China, which Atoui had investigated himself. But he'd sort of done a sound installation using turntables and clay pots and all sorts of amplification things. And the idea was that he was going to collaborate with musicians to make new music out of a kind of parallel world folk art. So although, you could say guilt is the motivator, a kind of bobo guilt is what draws people like me to these exhibitions where we can flay ourselves, and wear the hair shirt of remorse for the colonial era. Nevertheless, there is enough milk of dreams in there for you to, if you don't pay too much attention to the globs of curatorial text, which are often very ugly and very boringly written, but just kind of go in there and grab what fascinates you and what interests you, you will find inspiration. You will come away with your eyes opened, and you will have learned from the other without necessarily further othering the other.
Open University.
The joke, the same as structure.